Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Birch. I'm the president of the National Police Foundation, and I'm hosting this event on Twitter live. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for watching the event today. Ordinarily, we host these events on Facebook Live and YouTube Live, but due to some technical issues, we've switched it over to Twitter today, and we'll see how this works out. We appreciate everybody taking time to listen in, and if you're watching today on YouTube, thank you for checking us out in a recorded fashion. If you would, hit the subscribe button below so that you can stay connected with us on future episodes. Today, we're hosting another conversation in our series designed to reflect our mission as a national organization, and that is to advance policing through science and innovation. These conversations that we're having today and in the future will almost always feature a scientific or a technical finding, an insight, or an innovation that may help policing leaders in guiding and managing their agencies, help elected officials and community members gain a deeper insight into police organizations and policing overall, and expand our shared knowledge of what works in policing. This is essentially research translation that we're providing here. Today's event focuses on use of force and highlights recent research examining how the police and the public view force actions differently, and considers how that can be, even though it's often thought that the rules around what is justifiable, what is appropriate, and what is legal have been set for all of us by the Supreme Court. Now, according to the research that we're discussing today, and I'm going to quote here, it matters little to those outside of law enforcement whether a particular set of actions falls within the law or within agency protocol if the intuitive public reaction to viewing the episode evokes sufficient moral outrage. Many have arrived at this conclusion rhetorically, but hardly any have developed a model and tested this notion scientifically. This conversation today focuses primarily on an article that appeared in the journal Law in Human Behavior called Lay Evaluations of Police and Civilian Use of Force, Action Severity Scales. This article was published in 2019 in volume 43, number 3, and authored by Bradley D. Celestin and John Kruschke of Indiana University's Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. The authors have also further developed this research and are awaiting the publication of at least 2 additional articles on this same study. While they're not yet published, we'll talk a little bit about some of those additional research findings today as well, because they're very relevant and very interesting. I'm joined today by Dr. Celestin, who served as lead author on this publication. Dr. Celestin is an assistant professor of psychology and chair of the psychology and philosophy departments at Bethel College in North Newton, Kansas. He holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and certificate in neuroscience from Bethel College, and a PhD in psychology and a minor in statistics from and social neuroscience from Indiana University. His research interests include moral cognition, legal decision-making, and the intersection of these domains. Previously, he spent 11 years as a law enforcement officer at the local and federal levels. I'm also joined today by Lieutenant Stuart Greer of the Morristown, New Jersey Police Department, who oversees the criminal investigations unit there, as well as other departmental functions, including its internal affairs unit, as well as its public information component. Lieutenant Greer is a National Police Foundation Fellow and also an NIJ Lead Scholar and on the Executive Committee for the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing. Lieutenant Greer is actually on vacation today, but chose to spend his afternoon with us, which I'm sure makes his family very, very happy. So, Brad, I want to turn to you, but before I do, let me just remind our audience that we're going to try to take Q&A today. So if you want to send us some questions as you're watching and learning about this research, please do that. And we'll try to monitor that as well and have an opportunity to bring you into this conversation. But Brad, if you would just start us off a little bit by telling us about the background around this sort of angle of use of force. And talk about the research question that you hope to answer in this study and how you design the study very generally.
Sure. So we were interested in measuring experimentally how lay citizens, when they evaluate police use of force, what they're doing, and specifically whether it looks anything like what the police are doing, or at least what official police policy looks like. Importantly, there's been a smattering, well, a bunch of research actually, that looks at police use of force, but very often they'll focus on one specific part of the entire space of force severity, right? So research might look at deadly force, for example, or maybe they look at less lethal force. We wanted to look at all force together. Importantly, because actions, when they're evaluated by police agencies, are usually evaluated relative to one another, right? So if you have a civilian that is doing a particular action in resistance, then what's appropriate for police depends on what the civilian is doing. And so we tried to design a paradigm that would measure things, taking that into account.
That's outstanding, and a very interesting way that you went about this. We're going to dive more into that in just a minute, but let me ask you about something that you said in the article, and I'm going to quote here again. The quote is, "Because police use of force is such a highly moralized topic, it is especially vulnerable to ideological distortions, extreme levels of conviction, and confirmation biases that influence the way in which it's evaluated. In general, moralized attitudes have unique characteristics that include increased intolerance to others with dissimilar views, reduced cooperation, and inhibited ability to resolve disagreements. So to the extent moral polarization in this area is increasing, third-party observers on opposite sides are prone then to oversimplify in favor of their prior moral mandates, despite the complexity of nuanced details that are frequently present at the level of individual use of force cases." Can you talk about that a little bit? Tell me if I got it right or wrong, of course, but talk about that a little bit and tell us why that's such an important concept to understand here.
Yeah, so I think you did get it exactly right. And the point that I'm trying to make there, or that John and I were trying to make in the article, is that there's a rich literature documenting how human beings process moralized issues differently than they process other things, right? So classic example is if you and I disagree about whether we like broccoli, you like it and I don't like it, we can agree to disagree, and that's fine. I don't feel any need to call the police on you, right? But if you don't like murder and I do, we have a problem, right? This is an extreme example, but it illustrates the way in which moralized attitudes license violence and aggression, right? Either by me personally or on my behalf by the police. Likewise, if you flip that around and you sort of turn that lens on policing, police use of force, we argue, is becoming more and more moralized. And so moralized issues are viewed not just based on the totality of the circumstances of the incident, but with all of the things that I bring personally to my viewing of that particular event. And so my background, my experiences, my prior attitudes, my political beliefs, all sorts of things influence what I see, right? What I perceive when I see a video. Which goes a long way to explaining why two people can watch the same video of a police use of force incident and come away with very different assessments of that. So to tie it back in with sort of our research, what we were interested in doing is saying, hey, if we sort of back up to the group levels, can we say something substantive empirically about what people generally tend to do when they evaluate use of force, and how that differs from what the police generally tend to do.
Mm-hmm. And is this different from the topic of desensitization, right? Or is it essentially the same thing?
No, so it's they're related, right? One of the things we're guilty of in social psychology is having different names for the same phenomenon. so it's, yes, they're overlapping topics, I would say, but the moralizing process has been described very well by Jonathan Haidt as a process that binds and blinds. And what he means by that is that moralization probably evolved to help us tie ourselves together tightly in groups, which was necessary for us to survive. But it also blinds us to all of the inconvenient details that we want to leave out. So human beings engage in confirmation bias, right? When you Google something, you're searching for evidence to support whatever position you held before you ever typed anything into Google. And so the information age is dangerous in that way, or can be. We do the same thing when we evaluate use of force, right? People tend to, discount facts about cases that make them complicated if they've already decided who the good guys and the bad guys are. And we do tend to divide the world into good guys and bad guys.
Yeah, this is a fascinating issue because 2 weeks ago we were doing a session like this with Professor Robin Engel and a chief of police from Colorado. And we were talking about an incident that Robin was involved in from an oversight management perspective, where there was a use of force incident, a shooting. An outside consulting firm, third party, came in and looked at the incident and claimed that it was entirely preventable. Essentially, that there was something that went wrong there that could have been done differently. But then 2 different juries failed to convict in that case, and so you have at least three different parties involved in that one shooting incident that each saw it somewhere differently than another part of the process. And I guess, Lieutenant, do you see this often in the cases that you handle and sort of the public outreach that you do? Do you find that there's just extensive disagreement among people about seeing the same thing?
Yeah, I do, Jim. I see it a lot, mostly in my internal affairs capacity. Quite frequently, you'll see something where somebody makes a complaint. They feel they've been mistreated in some capacity. So our job as internal affairs is to take a look at that, to assess that complaint, and to determine if the officer acted appropriately or not appropriately. But that lens really is looking at it from a policy standpoint, where the actions that were taken are appropriate based upon the policy and the training and what we expect the officer to do. The disconnect, though, between what the citizen may expect to have happen and what the officer actually performs, those actions they perform, quite often my role will be to go back and explain that our review determined that the officer acted appropriately and within policy. And it's very difficult sometimes for the citizen to understand how that's possible based upon what they felt at the time of the incident.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. Brad, I want to come back to you to talk more about this study. And Andrew, if you can, show up the Solof Scale image if you have that. Wanted to talk a little bit about how you broke down use of force into a scale that you were able to use in the study. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. So one of the difficulties when you're researching police use of force is that there's not an absolute agreement across police agencies, even in the United States, about how to apply force or how to evaluate it. But there is a kind of largely agreed upon structure, right? So the Supreme Court has said that use of force must be objectively reasonable. But if you imagine, you're an officer on the street, you've got the Batman belt full of tools, you're confronted with a particular level of citizen resistance, and you have to choose what to do. Objectively reasonable doesn't really help you much. It's too general, right? It's like saying do the right thing. And so police agencies have come up with different kinds of structures to try to help them make decisions. And more than 80% of them use some kind of a rank ordered force options list. Sometimes that's called a force continuum, but really it's a set of bins that you can put different actions in. And so the picture that's displayed here is Solof is for 6 ordinal levels of force, is what that acronym means. And why 6 levels? Well, because the majority of agencies in the US use a 5 or a 6 level continuum, and researchers tend to recommend a 6 level. So we chose that. And you can see that, at level 1 here, you've got things like officer presence, very low level force. And that escalates all the way up to level 6, which is deadly force. So we binned the actions that we chose into each of these levels because, again, we wanted to have actions that were representative of the entire range of possibilities.
Now about how you took this scale and introduced it into the study. As I understand it, you had almost 700 subjects, right, that you had participating in the study?
That's right. Yeah, actually, we had very nearly 800, and then we had to exclude some because there are, always a few participants who don't pay attention and that sort of thing. So yeah, we wound up with about 700. We used participants both or people who were taking a psychology course, but also we used Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a way for us to recruit paid participants online from all across the US. And so there's a lot of demographic diversity in that sample, and it was split about 50-50. And then what we asked them to do we presented them with a very simple vignette. We said, hey, an officer and a citizen are in contact with one another. The officer did this, the civilian did that. Could you please rate the civilian action? Or could you please rate the officer action? And so even though we have these actions on the screen here split up into 6 levels, people who were participating in our experiment didn't know that. We didn't give them that information. We just said, hey, how morally appropriate is the officer's action from 0 to 100? Or how physically severe was the officer's action from 0 to 100?
Can we? I just want to make sure that I have a good sense of who responded and rated the 22 action types. How diverse was that sample?
Let's see. I'd have to look at the paper to give you exact numbers, but the age range was quite large. There were people who participated from all different racial groups, from different genders, etc. So, it wasn't perfectly representative in terms of the proportions across all different types of groups, but it was reasonably representative.
Yeah, and so then you asked them to look at these actions, this set of 22 actions, right? And Andrew, if you could show I believe it's the officer scale now that we want to show. You asked them to kind of tell you where these fall in terms of level of severity. Could you maybe explain, and feel free to use the image to help?
Yeah, so basically we asked people about 2 different dimensions. We asked them to rate the morality of the officer actions, but then we also asked them to rate just the sort of raw physical severity, because those are related, but 2 kind of different things. You might think a punch is, I don't know, between 0 and 100 at like a 60 in terms of physical severity, but maybe you think that the police punching people is especially wrong. So they're different dimensions, and that's what this picture is showing. Moral severity is plotted on the vertical axis, and physical severity is plotted on the horizontal axis. And a neat thing about this experiment is that not only do we get the the ratings themselves, but the model that we developed allowed us to infer statistically, where these actions are situated morally and physically across all of our participants. And so there's some interesting patterns that emerge from that.
So could you give us a couple of examples from the chart here?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things you'll notice is that the actions, we've color-coded them in accordance with that 6-level Force Continuum scale. And 3 of the 6 categories cluster tightly in the middle. That's what that red circle is circling. And basically that's telling us that if for all the actions except for handcuffing that are sort of beyond verbal but less lethal or non-lethal, people aren't differentiating them very well, right? Which is quite different from 3 distinct levels that you might see on an official police policy continuum. Another really interesting thing from my vantage point is when you look at verbal force and deadly force, that is the blue actions in the bottom left and the red actions in the top right, they're very spread apart. And I find that particularly fascinating with deadly force because it's so different from the way that law enforcement evaluates deadly force, right? So in the courts and for law enforcement, you're either justified or you're not. It's a binary way of evaluating. And if you're justified in using deadly force, it doesn't matter what you do. You can stab somebody with a pen, shoot them with your gun, blow them up with a bomb, right? Anything, as long as you're justified. If you're not justified, you can't do any of those things. But this suggests, those red dots in the top right, that people are not viewing it that way at all. People are viewing deadly force quite differently. In fact, the 2 actions that fall right on that vertical line, the fact that they fall there means that people view them to be roughly as morally as they do physically severe. But the 2 actions that are above that line, those actions are viewed as much more morally severe than physically severe. And those are, we assert, non-normative actions, right? That's slamming somebody's head into a curb or hitting them with a vehicle. They're weird, right? You think of the police, you think of guns. You don't think of the police and slamming somebody's head into a curb maybe, or hitting them with a car. And so our interpretation of that is that normativity matters for people, lay evaluators, right? People don't just care whether you're justified in using deadly force or not. They care what you do and whether it's normal for police to do that. And if it is normal, then they're more likely to support the action. And if it's weird, then they're really not likely to support it.
Yeah, I think what a great example that you use in your paper was the Dallas Police Department response to the shooter who barricaded himself in an office building, and they used a robot to apply deadly force, essentially killed him with explosives. What was the reaction to that, or how did you factor that in?
That's right. I think that's a great example, and that one has the added element of technology. You know, so far it's anecdotal, so I don't want to overreach. You know, we haven't done an experiment looking at that particular application of force, but we have done some follow-up work that supports this. And I think that's just a great example of an action that was novel. You know, people really complained about it, and when they did, they said things like, you know, this is not normal police behavior. That was one of the criticisms, you know, so it's even overt that that's why they were viewing it immorally, or at least part of the reason.
So the public reaction there was what you would expect from this research, was that it was a non-normative approach, and therefore there was concerns. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. Now, we have another graphic from the study, and I think if Andrew can put that up for us, I believe you asked the citizens to kind of place what the appropriate force level was in response to an action from a civilian. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So one of the nice things that the first study gave us was a map of perceived severity for a representative set of actions. And that's important because if you just ask people about an individual action and you don't know where that action is situated in their mind relative to other possibilities, it's hard to say, for example, whether they agree or disagree with a heuristic that law enforcement might use, right? So in addition to Solof Scale, a 6-level scale, officers will often be taught a heuristic, like officers can be one level above, might be a heuristic. And one of our pressing questions was, hey, do people agree with that or not? Or where do people expect officers to be at in terms of this one above and one below business? But you can't assess that until you have a map of representative actions to know what they view as above and below. So we took that, those scale values, and then we just presented people with a circumstance, and we said, hey, you know, officer and civilian interact. The civilian punches the officer in the face. Of these 22 actions the officer could do, which one is the most appropriate? And we had people choose. And so what you see on this plot is basically a frequency count. So on the vertical axis is officer actions, all possible. And civilian actions are on the horizontal axis. And they're color-coded by the Solof scale. But the bigger the dot, the more frequently people chose that particular action combination for the officer. And the striking thing to notice here is that when you shift the actions out to their latent estimates, most of the dots are below that vertical line. And what that tells you is that people expect officers to use less force than they're confronted with, which is a marked departure from the one above heuristic that officers are thinking. And so to sum that up, the grounds for disagreement might be laid just merely on the basis of the fact that people are expecting officers to use less force in general, and officers are expecting to use more force in general before you ever get into the details of a particular instance.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Lieutenant. How do you see this playing out every day in your work? I mean, it's just, you're in such a unique position because you do have criminal investigations, you do have internal affairs, and you do have public information. So you really see it touches on every piece of your role. I mean, how does this play out?
It really does. I think the findings of the study are fascinating because when you actually look at public expectations, I think too often there's an expectation that we, the police, know what is best and that we have a clear and objective set of standards, and that's what we teach our officers to do. I think when you go back to those, the idea of categories or bins of use of force, I think it's necessarily done by design to be simplistic. And I don't mean simplistic in terms of the actual force which is used, but I think there's a recognition within the profession that officers are going to have to make a very, very quick decision based upon a set of circumstances, each one of which is unique. So trying to overthink this or provide them with too many guardrails, if you will, could ultimately end up with people getting hurt, which is not what we want to do. I think when we look at the police profession itself, we're trying to think, what are we asking our people to do? And I think that the guiding principle of that one above, or match the force that you need, one above, is really to bring this to a successful, quick resolution with the least amount of injury. And I think the idea of applying that one level above is that way of doing that. Now, when you talk to people about specific incidents, trying to convey that message to people who sometimes don't want to hear it or don't understand the position you're coming from certainly makes it a challenge, without a doubt.
Yeah. So, Brad, how does that square? How does that notion of using more force to bring resolution to an incident more quickly, how does that square up with morality and severity in terms of what you studied?
Yeah, I think this is a really tricky issue. Police use of force is probably one of these things that intuitively, perhaps many of us feel like we have a better handle on what it's like than maybe we really do. So I think there's an element of expertise here. What I would say is, one conclusion I wouldn't draw from our findings is that we should, scrap force continua, because I think those exist because we need them. As Lieutenant Greer is saying, we need some scaffolding for officers to make quick decisions. These are decisions that are made in such a short time frame that if you don't have a heuristic like that, you're going to get a worse outcome. The question is sort of, how can we bridge the moral perceptions of the public with the structures that police have in place to help them make good decisions. And it's a hard problem. What moral psychology will tell us is, when issues are moralized, it's really hard for people to get an accurate picture.
And this is interesting because, as I think you both have alluded to, officers are trained based on these policies and these training principles of one level above, so that they don't have to spend time trying to consider what is going to be considered most moral or most appropriate in this case. I mean, it's a pretty simple way, if you will, of determining what level of force is appropriate. So it really is tricky when you think about, you have to introduce this concept of morality. What does the community think? I mean, that really puts officers in a difficult spot and a very tight timeline. Is that right, Lieutenant?
It is. And I think that maybe one of the central findings of the study for me is, when we're talking about trying to match officer actions with morality, it's not as if it's a singular morality. Morality is by its very nature spread across communities. Different people have different ideas of what is and what is not moral. So trying to introduce that at the time when force needs to be used, I think is just, I think it's a recipe for disaster. I think, as we've seen from this study, it's the disconnect is not a singular disconnect in a specific area. It's across the spectrum. And depending on who you speak to, their viewpoint of where moral, what's correct and what is not, makes it very difficult to navigate.
Yeah. So, Lieutenant, while we have you, I think one point made in the article is that while verbal commands and applying pepper spray may not be that far apart on the use of force continuum, right, in terms of where they rank in terms of level of severity, they're viewed as substantially different by citizens. And so the question is, does this give us reason to reconsider how we construct that continuum, at least to factor in the commonality, not the morality, but the commonality of force, in order to better align force options with lay person expectations? Does that?
Yeah, it was a really interesting finding, actually, because I think back to when I evaluate the use of force, and we'll take a look at every use of force our department outlays, and where I think we view this as that sort of linear progression for force. And I think the disconnect between using pepper spray or OC spray as used by a civilian versus an officer, I go back to that point again about finding a way to quickly and as painlessly as possible bring that to a resolution. I think for many officers, the idea of pepper spray is something that can be quickly applied. It's a temporary minor pain, as opposed to moving maybe further up the continuum using a sort of an impact weapon, which could cause a physical deformity or something. So I think when you get to those two ideas, it was really fascinating to see that disconnect. In terms of trying to realign the force options, again, I go back to the idea of morality not being a singular process. Around whose morality now do you restructure this? I thought of the, in New Jersey, we're fortunate we have the Camden County Police Department, who've been heralded widely for their reform efforts. And I know they work closely with a number of stakeholders to revise their use of force policy around some key core principles. They involve the union, they involve the community, the FOP, the ACLU, and so on. But what struck me about that when I was looking at that was even there, you apply these terms like reasonable, necessary, proportionate. And those, by their definition, are wholly subjective terms as well. So I don't know that you have the ability to restructure just based upon the data, but it certainly has to be part of the conversation.
And I hear what you're saying about morality, but what about commonality? What about the frequency of use? So that in this specific case, we were talking about pepper spray, but maybe we're talking about things like rubber bullets. Maybe we're talking about other kinds of tools that are not often used. And because of that, the community may find less acceptable.
Yeah, I think that goes back when you broaden out the study further. It definitely talked about legitimacy and that where do we sit within that social contract. And I would suggest that what you're seeing across the country now is a crisis of legitimacy. People are perhaps voicing their opinions that they don't believe what they believe that the police should be doing is necessarily falling in line with what's taking place. So I think when it comes to a commonality, that's where you have to have a further discussion with your community, recognizing again that policing in America is a very disparate profession. 18,000 plus police agencies. So I think commonality maybe that's a discussion for the police leaders and the community to try and work that together.
Well, and speaking of the community, I know we have a number of PIOs that regularly watch these recordings. So as a PIO, Lieutenant and Professor, I'd love to get your thoughts on this too. But as a PIO or overseeing the PIO component, if you will, how do you take this research and put it into action in the communications realm?
Well, I think that I think most PIOs will tell you that the first time you talk about it shouldn't be right after a crisis. Then there will be a time to have that conversation after a critical incident. But if that's the first time you're having the conversation with the key stakeholders in your community, you probably the horse has probably already left the barn. I think bringing, as part of your PIO component, bringing those elected officials and your policymakers, all the key stakeholders within your community, bringing them together to form those relationships, to talk about what it is that you do, why you take certain actions, what those expectations should be, finding out what their expectations are back, having that conversation ahead of time, I think is critical to knowing where you're going to stand when that incident does take place, and perhaps tempering some of those expectations, or at least having them an understanding of why you're using certain techniques or certain practices prior to that critical incident taking place.
Professor, from your standpoint, are there things that we can learn from this that give us kind of new angles, to talk to the community about? I mean, is there a way for us to get to that point of morality, that point of how normal something is? Are we able to address that at all through being able to communicate with the community, or are these just things that are hardwired in and no amount of communication is going to address those?
That's a great question. I think that we must have this conversation. There's a great saying that we have essentially two choices as human beings. We have conflict, conversation, and violence. And conversation must be what we strive for, even when we have difficult disagreements, and moral disagreements tend to be of the most difficult kind. So modeling that kind of conversation is, I think, something that law enforcement is increasingly doing well, and definitely, can do more of. If citizens feel like you're listening to them, that's a great sort of first step. But in terms of this research giving concrete things that you can do, one of the things is to pay attention to people's perceptions of the normativity of different actions, right? So if you're on the street, one sort of basic kind of thing you might think about if you're a patrol officer and you've got to choose between, punching someone and tasing them is, well, which one of those is more normatively or even more uniquely associated with police? That might be a better choice, and it might actually increase the odds that the public will agree with whatever you do, and it will be viewed as sort of less morally severe. So I think that's one of the interesting things that police can take from this. And that begs the question, what is the normativity of all possible actions? So I think that's a great thing that we need to investigate. And how do police actions become normal? Because there was a time when pepper spray was new, right? Yeah. And probably suffered from, increased perceptions of moral severity. Same thing with tasers. Same thing with any new technology. So that process by which police actions become normally associated with police surely must rely in part on rational justifications, right? If you explain to somebody, hey, if I tase someone instead of punching them, it reduces the risk of injury for both the officer and the civilian. That probably has a really meaningful impact.
And how about it's so fascinating because I remember when we first started talking about tasers, right? Was a lot of concern about the impact of tasers on people. And we had a lot of focus and attention from medical experts talking about the effects of the taser as a tool. Do we need to spend more time?
Well, it looks like we lost Jim there for a second.
I think we did.
So I think we did. Nothing like a live stream to lose your host. So folks, it looks like we lost Jim for a second. If you bear with us, the technical gurus are working behind the scenes, and there he is, he's back. So we're good to go.
So this is really why we have you on, Lieutenant. Thank you for holding down the fort there. I don't know how much of my question got picked up, but we spent a lot of time hearing from medical experts about the impact of the taser on individuals. Do we need to spend more time educating the public from a scientific and medical community about other types of force? Would that help address the morality and other questions?
I think that is a really interesting question, and it's actually one of the avenues that we're pursuing. What happens when you teach people, for example, about force continuums? Does this chart of moral and force, do the actions spread out in clusters, right? After you educate people about that, do they see more nuance in general? That's an open research question, as far as I'm aware, but I expect that it does.
Let me ask you now about the issue of legitimacy, right? And this is something I know you touched on a little bit in the article that we're talking about, and I know that it's a subject that you're diving more deeply into in these forthcoming articles. But how do perceptions of legitimacy of the police, how do they impact people's views around use of force?
Yeah, so legitimacy, above and beyond basically all other possible individual differences like race and gender, legitimacy beliefs about police tend to predict support for police. And there's a bunch of research on legitimacy. Tom Tyler does research on this, and a bunch of other people, right? And there are, the definition of legitimacy has evolved over time. So we looked at legitimacy because it is the most important predictor. And we looked at a couple of different things. We looked at felt obligation and norm alignment, right? So felt obligation is things like how much do you think you should do what the police tell you to do? But norm alignment kind of is strongly associated with what we've been talking about in terms of morality. Norm alignment is stuff like how much do your values overlap with the values of the police? And so we asked people about both of those, and then we factored that into our models. And one of the things we found that was really interesting is that, there's quite a difference, of course, which is in line with other research, but low legitimacy individuals seem to never reach a point where they're actually in support of deadly force by police, right? They never view it as appropriate, even when citizens are also using deadly force. And that's quite different from what individuals who have high legitimacy, where once the citizen action becomes so severe, they're okay with police using deadly force. And so that's a really stark disconnect. It's not clear how to resolve that, but the research demonstrates that it is there.
It's so fascinating because essentially what I think that means is that in those places within the community where legitimacy may be lowest overall, that's the place where you're going to have the hardest time explaining your actions and getting community support. Yet that is probably the area that you spend a lot of time in terms of policing. So, Lieutenant, I don't know what does this say for you? To you, I mean, this is really a key finding here.
It's a critical finding. And I think, I made a highlight here. We talked about education before, because one critical thing I think which ties into all this is when we talk about educating the public, we also need to start talking about educating our police leaders. And Jim, as you know, that the Police Foundation has been central in pushing out these research digests. We at ASAB, we've been doing the same thing, trying to distill research findings into a bite-sized bits that police leaders can be expected to read and digest and understand. Because I think the concern is too often the disconnect in legitimacy is that police officers are doing what they know to do to the best of their ability. And sometimes when their back gets against the wall, they try to do more of what they know to do and do it better. But if that's not perceived as being heading in the right direction, or if it goes counter to what the research suggests we should actually be doing, they may be driving the wrong way down the road. I think the education component of bringing the community and the police leaders together, then you have the researchers, the academics come in and say, this is what we know about policing. How does that change our joint views? That does both. It educates everyone in the community and the police, and it starts to build, again, those relationships. The legitimacy really is central to relationship building. It's the building that bank of social capital that, as I said, when you have a critical incident, and every agency is prone to having this, if you have a well-established bank of social capital from relationships and an understanding and mutual respect and trust, you're more prone to weather through that storm, I think.
Yeah, Professor, you have anything you want to add on this? How should agencies and executives be thinking about this legitimacy issue?
Yeah, I think Lieutenant Greer is exactly right. What I can offer you is a couple of lessons from social psychology. So there are two literatures in social psychology that I think relate to how it is that perhaps police leaders and police officers should to think about how to connect with communities. One of them is the literature on dehumanization, which has not been pointed at police as far as I'm aware, but really describes, what it is that we do when we view outgroups in general. I think that some of what has happened to police as a group recently is that they have become dehumanized in that sense. And so backing away from that, trying to be more human, we're trying to be perceived as more human rather than subhuman or even superhuman, right? Which might be where the police are, right? If people view you as a superhero, well, then the expectations for what you can do in a real encounter are quite different than when they realize, most police are not capable of jumping in the UFC ring and winning the match, But also there is a literature on stereotyping that I think really applies to police. And one of the lessons there that's really interesting to me is that people use stereotypical information when it's all they have, right? So if all I know is that Tim is a cop, whatever I believe about cops is probably what I believe about Tim. But if I learn individuating information about Tim, right? I learn about Tim's kids and about his life, then that information will be superseded, right? It'll supersede the stereotype information. And so I'll view him more as an individual and less as a member of a group. And I think that can be taken advantage of by police officers. And it's really a great call to sort of be yourself publicly so that people get to know you.
Great message. As we wrap up, any last comments either of you'd like to make or thoughts about this research?
I would just highlight some of the things we've already said, and I completely agree with everything that was just said. I think for many police officers, the idea of trying to show who you are goes counter to what our cultural norms are. The expectations that you build a wall, you put it up, you have this defense mechanism, and that's been seen to keep us as safer. And I think what we're starting to learn more and more now is that the exact opposite is true. It's a cultural shift. And again, that goes back to having that conversation based upon research to say, this is what the research suggests we do. If the police leader's ultimate goal is to keep our community safe and to keep our police officers safe, there's probably common ground there.
Great, well said. And Professor, thank you for this research. It's practical, it's usable, it's important. We need to do more in this area, so I hope you'll keep going.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It was great speaking with both of you.
Well, this has been a great conversation, despite our many technical challenges that we had in the beginning and halfway through, but I think it's still been productive. And what we hope that everyone takes away from these conversations is how important research and science is to strengthening our understanding and trust between communities and the agencies that serve them. More research and more translation of research is essential for us to all improve policing and improve our communities. I hope everyone will join us for our future conversations. This event has been recorded and will appear on YouTube later this week for viewing by those who may have missed this event. In closing, I want to thank my guests for their time today and for bringing the research to life. Dr. Celestin and Lieutenant Greer, thank you both, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.